Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to plunge right into those geopolitical currents that, well, they're really shaping our world, often in ways you don't see on the surface. We try to reveal the hidden patterns, the surprising truths.
Exactly.
And today, we're tackling what might just be the quietest, but maybe the most profound revolution happening right now on the global stage. It's a series of events that seem, kind of separate, disparate even. But when you look at them through the right lens, you start to see this remarkable strategic chess match unfolding.
It really is like a chess game. And it kicked off with something that maybe didn't get the headlines it deserved, something at the recent NATO summit.
Right. What didn't happen there was almost more significant than what did.
Precisely. While everyone focused on the usual declarations, the really striking detail often overlooked was the lack of a strong, unified condemnation about the Russia-Ukraine war in the final statements.
No big joint statement on that.
No. And that silence, it's incredibly loud, isn't it? It immediately makes you ask, well, why? Why was that kind of statement missing? What was going on behind the scenes? What did it signal?
That's the puzzle, exactly. And it wasn't just the silence, was it? Tied to that was this very firm, almost non-negotiable demand coming from the U.S.
Yes, the spending.
The spending. NATO allies, the message was, you must drastically increase defense spending. Not just to that 2% GDP target they've talked about for years.
Which many still weren't hitting.
Right. But to an unprecedented 5%. 5% of GDP. That's a huge leap for most of these countries.
Yeah.
It demands a massive reshuffle of national budgets.
Exponential, really. And this is where, the plot thickens, as they say. Germany.
Germany, yeah.
Okay.
Historically pretty reluctant on military spending, right? And facing some serious economic headwinds right now, especially in their big industrial sectors.
Correct. And yet, Germany, surprisingly, and actually quite enthusiastically, it seemed, agreed to this. Chancellor Merkel, even navigating a tricky government transition, committed to boosting Germany's defense spending from, about 1.9% currently?
Yeah, just under the old target.
All the way up to 5%.
5%. Okay, that really does raise eyebrows, doesn't it? Why would Germany, dealing with things like Volkswagen struggling in the Chinese EV market, factory slowdowns, maybe even big layoffs looming in cars and machinery, why would they jump on board with such a massive defense spending hike? It feels completely counterintuitive given their domestic economic problems.
It absolutely does on the surface. But this is where you really need to understand a concept called military Keynesianism.
Military Keynesianism. Okay, unpack that for us.
So imagine an economy like Germany's struggling because demand is down in its traditional big manufacturing areas. Cars, heavy machinery, that sort of thing.
Right.
Now, what happens if the government suddenly says, okay, we're going to buy a massive amount of stuff from those exact industries?
Like tanks, jets.
Exactly. Tanks, Eurofighter jets, sophisticated weapon systems. This stuff isn't made by little startups. It's the core business of those huge, established industrial giants, precisely the ones facing trouble in Germany.
So the spending isn't just about defense.
Not at all. It's about creating enormous guaranteed demand for their own products. It's basically using defense spending as a strategic stimulus package to breathe life back into key domestic industries. It's a surprising, maybe even slightly desperate form of economic engineering.
A dual-purpose strategy, though. Bolster defense capability and inject serious cash into a struggling economy. That adds a really surprising layer to Germany's quick agreement. It's like they saw a geopolitical problem offering an economic solution.
That's exactly it. And the intrigue here, it just deepens when you contrast this with what's happening elsewhere. While NATO, pushed by the U.S., is dramatically scaling up defense spending.
Putin does the opposite.
President Putin of Russia recently announced that Russia actually intends to reduce its own defense budget.
Hang on. NATO spends way more. Russia spends less. That sounds like a total contradiction. Unless these moves, which look like they're going in opposite directions, are actually, coordinated pieces on this global chessboard.
Yeah.
Necessary steps, maybe. Preconditions for something much bigger.
Yeah.
Like winding down the Russia-Ukraine war.
That's certainly the argument gaining traction. That each of these moves, however contradictory they look at first glance, is actually helping to set a new strategic landscape. It's maybe less about immediate military buildup and more about establishing new baselines, new realities for a future peace negotiation.
Setting the stage for a resolution, perhaps.
Potentially. And all these big global shifts, this quiet revolution we're watching unfold, it ultimately leads us back to one central, often, let's face it, enigmatic figure, Donald Trump. Understanding these recent global moves, NATO spending, Germany's economic thinking, Putin's budget announcement, it becomes absolutely critical if you want to anticipate Trump's next steps. Especially, and this is key, regarding the U.S.'s very long, very complicated relationship with North Korea.
So we need to connect these dots. Some dots maybe you never even thought were related. We're really on a mission here in this deep dive. Extract those crucial insights from what's happening globally to understand the deeper currents shaping international relations.
Exactly. It's about seeing the underlying pattern.
Okay, let's dive into Trump then. This apparent paradox. A lot of people, observers, pundits, they often describe his diplomatic style as, well, unpredictable, chaotic even.
That's the common narrative.
He breaks the rules, doesn't follow the script. But what if that perception is missing something vital? What if his actions, yeah, they're different from recent presidents, sure, but maybe they aren't random. Maybe they're rooted in a deliberate kind of hybrid approach, drawing directly from the playbooks of two really influential Republican presidents before him, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan.
That's a really crucial way to reframe Trump's foreign policy, and I think it's essential if you want to understand his moves, past and future. When you look at the history, his behavior starts to look less like an anomaly, less random, and more like a very specific, almost calculated blend of these past strategies.
Okay, let's start with Nixon. Where did he come from politically?
Richard Nixon's political career really took off in that intense anti-communist atmosphere of McCarthyism in the 1950s. You have to remember the context. This was an era just gripped by Cold War fear. It was massively ramped up by two huge events back to back. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested their atomic bomb in August 1949.
Shockwaves.
Huge shockwaves. And then, just 2 months later, October 1949, Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China, Communist China. Nixon, along with Reagan actually, became prominent figures in that whole anti-communist witch hunt. They hammered the Democratic administration, saying they were soft, even suggesting they'd let critical U.S. nuclear secrets and other info leak to the Soviets and Chinese. Nixon, he was a young lawyer from California back then, a real hardliner on this, a proponent of McCarthyism. He rose fast in the Republican Party.
Became vice president under Eisenhower pretty quickly.
That's right, in 1953, just as the Korean War armistice was being signed in July '53. And throughout that whole period, Nixon was consistently, relentlessly anti-communist. Famously said, communists are not to be trusted.
Okay, so the absolute picture of an anti-communist crusader.
Yeah.
A hawk through and through. But then came the political earthquake, right? When he ran for president again in '68 after losing to JFK earlier.
Yes.
His big promise was ending the Vietnam War, which of course meant negotiating directly with communists, his sworn enemies. For a guy with Nixon's history, that was genuinely shocking, a complete reversal, it seemed. How did he manage that shift? What allowed it?
It was really a masterclass in pragmatic politics, in statecraft. Once he got into office in 1969, Nixon rolled out what became known as the Nixon Doctrine.
The Nixon Doctrine.
And this policy, it echoes a lot of what we hear from the U.S. today about allies pulling their weight. It basically said, U.S. allies need to take more responsibility for their own defense. The U.S. would mainly offer support with its nuclear umbrella, but it would cut back on conventional troop commitments.
And the impact was felt immediately.
Oh, immediately. And profoundly all over the world. Take South Korea, for example. The U.S. pulled out thousands of its troops in 1970-71.
And this is where, a really important insight pops up, especially if you want to understand modern defense industries. That U.S. withdrawal under the Nixon Doctrine, it directly forced South Korea under President Park Chung-hee at the time into this desperate but ultimately successful drive for self-reliant defense.
A wake-up call.
A huge wake-up call. It led straight to them setting up the Agency for Defense Development. And that foundational work, that's the origin story of today's K-defense industry. The one producing advanced weapons, exporting globally. It's kind of amazing how a U.S. withdrawal inadvertently helped create this new defense powerhouse.
It's a classic example of unintended consequences shaping history. But arguably, Nixon's most unthinkable, most historically shocking move was still ahead of him.
Going to China.
His secret trip to Beijing and then meeting Mao Zedong in 1972. Look, the Trump-Kim summit in 2018 was huge, groundbreaking. But Nixon meeting Mao, you could argue that was even more stunning, more audacious.
Why more?
Because Nixon wasn't just generally anti-communist. He was a vocal, ardent crusader specifically against China's communist government. And Mao Zedong had incredibly deep personal reasons to hate the U.S. His own son was killed by American bombing during the Korean War almost right after he arrived there.
Wow. So you have these two figures, representing totally opposite ideologies, carrying deep personal bitterness, suddenly shaking hands for the world to see. It must have seemed impossible, a betrayal of everything they supposedly stood for.
Yeah.
What was the logic?
It just perfectly illustrated that core principle of great power politics, the one that often just steamrolls ideology. Ideology is just a facade. National interest dictates alliances.
National interest above all.
Exactly. We've seen other equally shocking examples, right? Like the Hitler-Stalin Non-Aggression Pact in 1939. Two totally opposed regimes making a deal out of perceived national interest. Nixon meeting Mao had two huge objectives. First, the immediate one, find a way out of Vietnam. That meeting completely shifted the global power balance, and it paved the way for the Paris Peace Accords just 10 months later.
Which got Kissinger the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right. And second, Nixon wanted to kickstart détente, a period of easing tensions with the Soviet Union. That meeting with Mao helped achieve that, leading to big agreements like SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It brought in an era of much lower East-West tension in Europe, a huge change from the nuclear brinkmanship of the previous decades.
It's really incredible how fast the whole geopolitical map can be redrawn when national interest just takes over from ideological purity. Okay, let's pivot now to that other Republican icon, Ronald Reagan. He also started out as a fierce anti-communist, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Reagan's early career was all tangled up with the anti-communist drive in Hollywood. Back in 1949, he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he actively led purges against suspected communist influences in the movie business.
Right, the Hollywood blacklist era.
Exactly. Then when he won the presidency in 1980, he immediately took this incredibly aggressive stance against the Soviet Union, famously, defiantly called it the evil empire.
The evil empire. That phrase defined the era.
It did. And then he launched one of the most ambitious and frankly controversial defense projects of the entire Cold War, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, popularly known as Star Wars.
Star Wars, right. The space lasers.
Pretty much. This kind of fantastical idea of a space-based missile defense shield, something that could supposedly zap incoming Soviet ICBMs out of the sky. The sheer scale of it, the technological challenge, the potential threat, it sent absolute shockwaves through the Soviet leadership who were already struggling economically.
So evil empire, Star Wars. Pure confrontation. But just like Nixon, Reagan also made this unexpected historic turn. He shifted from confrontation towards cooperation. What happened? What prompted that change?
Well, the momentum for a shift really picked up after that tragic incident in September 1983, the KL-007 shootdown. A South Korean airliner shot down by Soviet fighters, everyone on board killed.
Terrible event.
Horrific. But strangely, despite the tragedy, it actually spurred more intense back-channel talks between the U.S. and the Soviets. The Soviet Union, you have to remember, was already economically drained by the long war in Afghanistan, and they were increasingly terrified by the prospect of SDI, this potentially ruinous arms race in space. So they started actively looking for a different path, something less confrontational.
And that led to Gorbachev.
Exactly. It ultimately led to that series of historic meetings between Reagan and the new reformist Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev starting in 1985. These summits, which seemed so unlikely at first, they fundamentally thawed the Cold War, ended it, really, and paved the way for one of the biggest geopolitical shifts of the 20th century, German reunification.
So Nixon and Reagan, you see this really striking pattern, start out as absolute anti-communist hardliners, but then execute these massive, unexpected diplomatic U-turns that ultimately served what they saw as America's national interest, ending a war, opening up China, ending the Cold War.
Precisely. And when you connect those historical dots back to Donald Trump, the pattern becomes, well, strikingly clear, I think. Trump, very much like Nixon, is a transactional genius. He's always looking for the deal, right? Always assessing the leverage points.
The art of the deal.
The art of the deal. And he combines that sharp transactional sense with the kind of Hollywood action flair and media-savvy deal-making skill you saw with Reagan. He just intuitively understands how to use perception, how to disrupt things, how to create that moment for negotiation.
So his seemingly weird actions, like meeting Kim Jong-un in 2018.
They're not random outliers. They actually follow this established pattern. Prioritize what you perceive as national interest, prioritize the deal over rigidly sticking to long-held ideological positions, and frankly, Maybe only a political outsider like Trump, someone not completely steep in that traditional Cold War mindset that often ties the hands of mainstream politicians, could have actually pulled off a meeting like the one with Kim without facing immediate political implosion.
It suggests his future actions might be, well, more predictable than people think, if you understand the playbook.
Exactly. It's a game of leveraging perceived strength and exploiting perceived weakness. It's transactional at its core.
That really does offer a completely different way to look at his foreign policy. Not a wild card necessarily, but this fascinating hybrid of historical precedents. Okay, now this brings us right to a question that I know puzzles a lot of people. Why did the U.S. under Trump launch that bunker buster strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, but has historically held back from direct military action against North Korea? Even when, as you mentioned, strikes were seriously planned in the past, it seems like a major paradox.
It is a fascinating paradox, isn't it? A real tale of two targets. And understanding the very distinct differences between Iran and North Korea in this context is absolutely crucial. Let's first go back to that 1994 North Korea scenario under President Clinton.
Right. Defense Secretary Perry had plans drawn up.
Meticulously planned, a surgical strike on North Korea's Yongbyon nuclear facilities. And it's really important to remember, Yongbyon back then was much more vulnerable. The key facilities were mostly above ground. So a relatively straightforward missile strike probably could have done significant damage.
Militarily feasible, then?
Yes, but despite that military feasibility, the U.S. didn't pull the trigger. And there were three critical, interconnected reasons why they held back.
Okay. What were those crucial factors stopping them?
First, and perhaps most importantly, the unique geography of the Korean Peninsula. That direct military confrontation line, the DMZ, between North and South Korea, it's incredibly short, it's intensely militarized, and it's extremely volatile. Absolutely. A surgical strike, no matter how precise you think it is, carried an astronomically high risk of instantly escalating into a full-blown conventional war. And that war would spread like wildfire across the densely populated South. North Korea had and still has the capability to rain down devastating artillery and missile fire on Seoul, a megacity of millions just miles from the border within minutes. The potential human catastrophe was just unimaginable. Second, there was a serious lack of political will, especially from the South Korean side. The South Korean president at the time, Kim Young-sam, was vehemently opposed to any preemptive strike.
He wouldn't support it.
He was deeply concerned, rightly so, about the catastrophic humanitarian fallout for his own people. Think about mass evacuations of U.S. military families, yes, but also millions of South Korean civilians from the capital region. His absolute opposition was a huge, maybe even the decisive break on military action. And the third reason, which people sometimes underestimate, was the potential economic impact. A conventional war on the Korean Peninsula wouldn't just be a regional disaster, it would trigger a catastrophic economic shockwave across the entire East Asian economy.
Because of who's involved there.
Exactly. Think about it. South Korea, Japan, China. These aren't small players. They're massive oil consumers, and they're indispensable producers of just about everything the global economy relies on, from semiconductors to cars to electronics. The ripple effect of a war there, shutting down supply chains, halting trade, crashing markets would spread globally, crippling the world economy in ways the U.S. or the global financial system simply couldn't absorb without facing severe long-term damage. The economic calculation just made military action unthinkable.
So even a supposedly surgical strike had this unbearable risk of triggering a massive regional war with devastating human costs and a global economic meltdown. That certainly explains the caution back then. But then fast forward to the Trump administration, and we did see a targeted strike, a bunker buster aimed at Iranian nuclear facilities. What was different? What changed in the strategic calculation to allow that strike?
Again, there were three really distinct differences that allowed for that decision. First, the geography is vastly different. Between Iran and Israel, you've got this significant buffer zone, about 1,000 kilometers, mostly comprising Iraq.
A big gap.
A huge gap. And that distance fundamentally changes the escalation dynamics. It makes a rapid, direct conventional war flaring up immediately after a surgical strike much, much harder to achieve. It allows for a more contained operation without that immediate, widespread conventional spillover into heavily populated allied territories. Second, the political will was the complete opposite of the Korea situation. In the Iran context, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu wasn't just okay with it, he was actively pushing for the strike.
Israel wanted it.
Vigorously. So the U.S. had a powerful, influential ally in the region strongly advocating for the action. That provided crucial diplomatic cover and strategic alignment, which was absent in '94 regarding Korea. And third, and this is really, really pivotal, the perceived economic impact on the United States itself was vastly different. Now, sure, an attack on Iran could definitely cause a short-term spike in oil prices, but Iran is no longer the single critical oil producer that holds the entire global market hostage in the way it once might have.
Because of U.S. shale.
Exactly. The U.S. shale gas revolution, which really took off under the Obama administration and continued, has fundamentally transformed the U.S. energy picture. The United States is now a major oil exporter. That dramatically reduces its deep dependence on Middle Eastern oil.
Less vulnerable to price shocks from there.
Significantly less vulnerable. And this strategic shift lessens the long-term economic shock of disruptions in that region. Just think back for context. The 2003 Iraq War, pushed hard by neocons like Dick Cheney, saw oil prices go through the roof. Yes, it enriched oil companies, but it severely drained U.S. national power, contributing directly to the massive national debt we see today, now over $36 trillion. The economic situation for the U.S. now, especially regarding oil, is fundamentally different. It gives the U.S. much more strategic flexibility.
So the U.S. has built this economic cushion, in a way, thanks to its own energy production. That's profound strategic change. But even with these critical differences, geography, political will, economics, the stark reality remains, right? North Korea, even today, is still seen as too difficult, too dangerous to strike directly.
Absolutely. Still untouchable in that sense. And the main reason for that continued deterrence is North Korea's significantly advanced and still advancing nuclear arsenal. Since 1994, over 3 decades, their capabilities have just transformed dramatically. They're vastly more sophisticated, more robust.
How advanced are we talking?
Well, look at the data from respected sources like CPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Their current estimates put North Korea's nuclear warhead count somewhere between 50 and 100. Now, that includes not just fully assembled warheads, but also a significant stock of fissile material, the stuff you need to make bombs that can be quickly weaponized.
So potentially quite a large arsenal.
It puts them roughly in the same strategic league as a country like Israel in terms of estimated arsenal size. And critically, North Korea is the only nuclear state outside the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council: China, France, Russia, UK, US, the only one that has successfully developed and demonstrated intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that are capable of directly hitting the US mainland.
That is the absolute game changer, isn't it? The ability to credibly threaten the continental United States.
It changes everything. And it's not just ICBMs. North Korea has also been developing tactical nuclear weapons like the Hwasong-31, which are designed for battlefield use. And they've openly talked about developing advanced hypersonic missiles, the kind that are really hard for current missile defenses to stop.
Hypersonic Sioux.
Yes. And crucially, their nuclear capability hasn't just grown in numbers. It's significantly improved in quality and sophistication. For example, during the Biden administration, they successfully developed solid-fuel ICBMs. The Hwasong-18 is the big one, first successfully launched in October 2023.
Why is solid fuel such a big deal?
Solid-fuel missiles are a critical leap forward because they are much, much harder to detect and hit preemptively. Liquid-fuel missiles, which they relied on before, need this lengthy, very visible fueling process before they can launch. Solid-fuel missiles, they can be launched rapidly, often from mobile launchers that are hard to track, giving your adversary almost no warning time. The U.S. military, including the Joint Chiefs, they absolutely do not underestimate this sophisticated and rapidly evolving capability anymore.
So what does this all mean for how international politics actually works? It sounds like a clear case of strength versus weakness playing out on the world stage.
It really is. This fundamental difference in nuclear and missile capabilities, their demonstrated advancements. It's precisely why someone like Donald Trump, who's often called the emperor of harsh words, right? Known for his tough talk and deal-making. It's why he uses surprisingly friendly, even kind of deferential language towards Kim Jong-un, while at the same time using very harsh words and taking decisive military action against Iran. The message it sends globally is undeniable. North Korea's advanced, proven nuclear and missile punch gives it a different standing. It demands a more cautious, maybe even more respectful approach from major powers.
That analysis really provides an eye-opening look at the cold calculus of global power.
Okay, so let's shift back to Iran then. After the U.S. strike on their nuclear facilities and this current, maybe fragile ceasefire, what are Iran's options now? Where do they go from here? You've sketched out 3 pretty distinct paths they could take. Yes, Iran is definitely at a major crossroads right now. They face, broadly speaking, three primary strategic choices, and each one has vastly different consequences for their future. The first option, which I tend to call the bin Laden model, would involve, some surge of revolutionary anger leading to 9/11-style terrorist attacks against the U.S.
Direct terrorism.
Direct, large-scale terrorism. Now, my assessment, the probability of Iran actually choosing this path is very low, maybe 10%. Sure, some radical factions might push for it, but the consequences for Iran itself would be absolutely catastrophic. The U.S. has these deep national traumas from Pearl Harbor and 9/11. An attack like that would inevitably trigger an overwhelming, relentless U.S. air campaign, critically, probably without ground troops this time, just sustained aerial bombardment, coupled with even tighter economic strangulation, making life utterly unbearable for ordinary Iranians. That path is just unsustainable for the regime in the long run. It's self-defeating.
So direct terrorism is basically a dead end, just invites massive retaliation. What's the second possible strategy for Iran?
The second option is what I call the Kim Jong-il model. In this scenario, Iran decides to just keep going down the nuclear path, continue pursuing high-enrichment uranium. Remember, they're at 60% now, they need 90% for weapons grade, and actively work towards full nuclear weaponization. Testing a bomb, miniaturizing a warhead.
Doubling down on the nuclear program.
Exactly. This path implies the current ceasefire is just a temporary pause, not a real step towards lasting peace. The probability here, I'd say it's medium, maybe around 40%, and this is a big other. Iran faces huge challenges that North Korea didn't or overcame earlier. Their nuclear tech is estimated to be maybe 23 years behind North Korea's. Crucially, Iran hasn't done a verified nuclear test to prove a weapon design works. They haven't shown they have a miniaturized warhead that can actually fit on a missile. Choosing this path basically condemns Iran to another 2 decades minimum of severe economic pain under crippling international sanctions. And given their society, their internal pressures, that looks increasingly hard to sustain.
Right, like trying to replicate North Korea's past, but starting much further behind, and maybe with less societal tolerance for hardship. Okay, so what's the third path? The more optimistic one.
The third, and I would argue the most rational option, is the Sadat Model. This is where Iran chooses to make a comprehensive peace deal with Israel and the United States. It draws that direct historical parallel to Egypt's leader, Anwar Sadat.
Who made peace with Israel at Camp David.
Exactly, in 1979. And you have to remember how huge that was. Before 1979, Egypt was Israel's biggest, most persistent enemy. They'd fought 4 major wars. Nasser, Sadat's predecessor, had even nationalized the Suez Canal back in '56, sparking a major crisis.
Right.
But after Egypt suffered really damaging setbacks in the 1967 war, losing the entire Sinai Peninsula, losing control of the Suez Canal, Sadat, who came after Nasser, had this stark realization. Constantly fighting Israel was bleeding Egypt dry. Meanwhile, his supposed oil-rich brother Arab nations, they were profiting from high oil prices, but not really sharing the burden of the fight.
So Sadat decided national interest trumped Arab brotherhood. A tough, pragmatic calculation.
A profoundly pragmatic shift. His assessment led him to make that unthinkable offer of peace to Israel. He even flew to Jerusalem, addressed the Israeli Knesset directly, an act of incredible political bravery at the time. His motivation was clear and tangible: get the Sinai Peninsula back and regain control of the Suez Canal, which was absolutely vital for Egypt's economy, for revenue.
And the result was the Camp David Accord.
The historic Camp David Accords in 1979. Peace between these longtime enemies. And ironically, this breakthrough for peace was immediately followed by the Iranian Revolution, which was initially dead set against any such peace deals. Now, for Iran today, the probability of them choosing this Sadat model, I actually rate it as high, maybe 50%, and it's significant if Iranian politicians and the Iranian people are allowed to make a genuinely rational choice based on their country's long-term well-being and prosperity.
And what would that rational choice for peace actually unlock for Iran? What's the potential upside if they took that path?
Iran has enormous, largely untapped potential. You're talking about a young, vibrant, fast-growing population, 90 million now, heading towards 100 million soon. They have significant scientific and technological capabilities, a strong intellectual tradition, and importantly, they're food self-sufficient, which is a big advantage in that region. If they were to abandon the nuclear weapons program as part of a peace deal and then see international sanctions lifted, it's realistic to think Iran could transform itself into the wealthiest, most dynamic nation in the wider Middle East within, say, 20 years.
That is a really compelling vision. But what makes Iran different? Why might they be able to choose this path, unlike North Korea, which seems permanently locked into its nuclear strategy?
There are several really key distinctions, I think, that suggest Iran has more potential flexibility, a different possible path. First, citizen awareness. Iranian citizens are just far more connected to the outside world, more globally aware. They vocally express desires for a better quality of life, for economic opportunities. That's a huge contrast to North Koreans who live under this near totalitarian, information-starved, isolated regime.
More internal pressure for change in Iran.
Definitely. Second, the political system itself. Yes, Iran has its religious leadership, but it also has a presidential election system. That allows for at least some internal dissent, some public debate, some semblance of democratic process. It's fundamentally different from North Korea's monolithic, hereditary dictatorship where power is absolute, centralized, unquestioned. Third, you have alliances. North Korea has formal military alliances with big powers, Russia and China, which provide a significant security guarantee, a deterrent against a direct U.S. attack. Iran doesn't have those kinds of formal, binding military alliances that would guarantee protection if the U.S. decided to act militarily.
Less of a safety net.
Much less. Fourth is geopolitical vulnerability. Unlike the Korean Peninsula, which is incredibly dense and economically interconnected any conflict, there immediately hits major global economies like China, Japan, South Korea. Iran is more geographically isolated in that sense. That relative isolation means the U.S. could, theoretically, keep striking without limit if Iran stubbornly keeps pursuing nuclear weapons. That makes the nuclear path potentially economically and socially unsustainable for Iran in a way it might not be for North Korea.
Interesting point.
And finally, we need to challenge this whole idea that nuclear weapons are some kind of magic bullet, a panacea. They just aren't. They don't guarantee security or victory. Look at history. The U.S. had overwhelming nuclear superiority but lost wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower. It lost in Afghanistan. Nuclear weapons are not some cure-all that magically secures your regime or guarantees you win conflicts.
That's a really important counterpoint to the usual thinking about nuclear deterrence being the ultimate security guarantee. So you're essentially suggesting the Sadat model, the peace path, is the most rational choice for Iran's future, offering a road to real prosperity and integration.
Yes, I believe it represents the most logical, the most strategically advantageous path for Iran towards prosperity, stability, and rejoining the global community. But, of course, the ultimate decision lies within Iran's complex leadership structures and, ultimately, with the will of its people. My analysis just suggests it offers the highest probability for a positive, transformative outcome in the long run.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, let's circle back then to North Korea. You mentioned earlier Trump's surprisingly, maybe even confusingly friendly rhetoric towards Kim Jong-un. How does that fit into this strength versus weakness dynamic we've been exploring?
It fits perfectly. It's almost a textbook illustration. Trump's pragmatism, his transactional nature, it directly influences his rhetoric. If a country, even an adversary, demonstrates undeniable, significant power like North Korea's nuclear and missile capability, he approaches it with a different calculation. He seeks a deal, not necessarily confrontation first. It's a direct result of North Korea's advanced, robust, and proven capabilities.
Strength commands a different kind of attention.
Exactly. And let's tie this back to where we started, the NATO summit. The U.S. signaling it wants to reduce its defense commitments in Europe explicitly to focus more on the Indo-Pacific, mainly to counter China. Well, that implicitly frees up strategic resources, frees up diplomatic energy for potentially more direct engagement, maybe even serious negotiation in Northeast Asia.
Yeah.
With North Korea.
Right. Shifting focus. Which brings us to that really pivotal moment.
Yeah.
The 2019 Hanoi summit between Trump and Kim. At the time, a lot of people just saw it as Trump walking away because he couldn't get the deal he wanted. But it sounds like you're saying the reality was much more complicated, that he was constrained by things beyond his immediate control.
Very much so. The Hanoi summit didn't fail because Trump didn't genuinely want a deal. I think he did. It failed because he was profoundly boxed in by major external and crucially domestic political forces at that exact moment.
What kind of forces?
Well, inside his own administration, it was heavily populated at the time by neoconservatives, many of the same people who had pushed for the 2003 Iraq War. And these figures held this fundamental ideological opposition to striking any kind of comprehensive deal with North Korea. They saw North Korea as simply an irredeemable rogue state. Their influence inside the White House was significant.
So he's trying to make a deal, but surrounded by key advisors who are dead set against it philosophically. That's a recipe for trouble.
A huge internal conflict. And then Simultaneously, literally while the summit was happening in Hanoi, Trump was facing intense, escalating political heat back home. The Mueller investigation was still going on, a constant threat to his presidency. And critically, his former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, was testifying before Congress, making very damaging statements about Trump.
Terrible timing.
The worst possible timing. If Trump had actually made a big, comprehensive deal with Kim Jong-un right then, given that political firestorm, he would have almost certainly faced immediate, ferocious impeachment efforts. And you saw how the mainstream U.S. media reacted too. They largely celebrated the fact that no deal was reached. They framed it as Trump being wise, avoiding a bad deal. They didn't really acknowledge, or maybe didn't want to see, the deeper internal and external pressures that were really driving the outcome.
So the failure was less about the potential deal itself and more about the perfect storm of political opposition and vulnerability surrounding Trump at that moment. How did Kim Jong-un take this, though? He seemed genuinely invested in the process.
That's what's really interesting. After the public failure in Hanoi, Trump and Kim had that brief, impromptu meeting at Panmunjom at the DMZ. And reports suggest Trump essentially apologized for how Hanoi turned out. And then, remarkably, Kim Jong-un chose not to conduct any further ICBM tests or nuclear tests for 2 full years, basically, from late 2017, before the diplomacy started in earnest, right through to the end of 2020, the end of Trump's term.
2 years of quiet on the testing front.
Which strongly suggests, I think, that Kim was being patient. He believed a comprehensive deal might still be possible once Trump was politically freer, maybe in a second term. He was willing to wait.
But then, of course, Joe Biden won the election, and U.S. policy towards North Korea shifted dramatically back towards a more traditional hardline stance. Was that, looking back, a strategic misstep from the perspective of potential diplomacy?
Well, in my view, yes. It probably represented a critical missed opportunity, a misstep. Why? Because many of those same neoconservatives who had opposed Trump's diplomatic efforts with North Korea then shifted their support towards the Biden administration, and they significantly influenced its return to a more hardline, non-engagement policy.
The neocons found a home in the new administration, too.
It seemed that way, and I'd also argue that the Russia-Ukraine war itself, which I personally believe was largely preventable and significantly fueled by persistent neocon influence, especially from certain circles in the UK, was a major strategic distraction. A miscalculation by the Biden administration in terms of global priorities and managing limited resources.
And what was North Korea doing during this period of U.S. hardline policy?
They weren't sitting idle. Under the Biden administration's approach of sort of strategic patience, which North Korea likely saw as neglect or hostility, Pyongyang dramatically accelerated its nuclear program. They hit major milestones, successfully developing those solid-fuel ICBMs like the Hwasong-18 in October 23, even achieving multi-warhead capabilities, according to some reports. The U.S. military and intelligence community, they are definitely not underestimating North Korea's capabilities anymore. They know North Korea possesses the clear, credible ability to threaten the entire U.S. mainland.
So North Korea effectively used that period to really solidify and advance its nuclear deterrent. What about its relationship with China during this time? I've read reports that Kim Jong-un felt, well, let down or even betrayed by Beijing.
He absolutely did, by many accounts. Despite all the rising tensions between the U.S. and China, Beijing, somewhat surprisingly, continued to largely enforce strict international sanctions against North Korea.
China kept the sanctions pressure on.
For the most part, yes. They restricted crucial trade flows. And, really importantly, they refused to accept large numbers of North Korean laborers, which is a vital source of hard currency for Pyongyang. This perceived lack of support, this betrayal by its traditional main ally, is what really pushed North Korea to seek a new partner. And that led directly to forging a full, formal military alliance with Russia in 2024.
North Korea-Russia military alliance. That's a huge deal.
It's a major development with serious security implications. My biggest concern, frankly, is the potential transfer of advanced nuclear submarine technology from Russia to North Korea. If North Korea develops submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, that drastically complicates defense for the U.S. and its allies. SLBMs are much harder to detect and track than land-based missiles.
A whole new level of threat.
Exactly, and we're seeing tangible signs of this new alliance already. North Korea recently sent, reportedly, around 15,000 troops to Russia to support its war effort there. What Kim Jong-un is doing now is pursuing what his regime calls equidistance diplomacy, trying to skillfully balance his relationships between China and Russia to maximize his own leverage, his own strategic autonomy.
Playing them off each other, perhaps?
To some extent, yes. maximizing his options.
Okay, so with all these really complex shifts happening, North Korea has significantly boosted capabilities, this new alliance with Russia, the broader geopolitical chess game. Where does this all lead? Is a U.S.-North Korea summit really on the cards again? Is it imminent?
I think the consensus, even within the mainstream U.S. foreign policy establishment, is shifting dramatically. You're seeing major outlets like the New York Times and even traditionally more hardline conservative foreign policy scholars like Victor Cha now openly saying that full denuclearization, that old goal of CVV, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, well, it's looking increasingly unrealistic, maybe even unachievable in the near term.
So the goalposts are moving.
The thinking is shifting towards pragmatism, a phased approach to denuclearization, one involving gradual steps, reciprocal concessions, confidence-building measures. That's now being seen not just as preferable, but maybe as the only inevitable way forward. Therefore, my prediction is yes, a U.S.-North Korea summit is highly likely, perhaps even as early as this October, maybe coinciding with the APEC summit, perhaps held at Panmunjom, or somewhere else mutually agreed upon.
October, wow, that's soon. The conditions, both internationally and maybe even domestically within both countries, seem to be aligning. And both sides, in their own ways, seem to be signaling a renewed readiness for high-level talks.
A potential U.S.-North Korea summit by October. That would be a massive development, completely reshaping Northeast Asian diplomacy. But you also hinted that maybe we should be paying even closer attention to another player, one often overlooked in this context, Japan. Why would a potential Japan-North Korea summit be such a significant wildcard?
That's right. While everyone's focused on the U.S.-North Korea possibility, a Japan-North Korea summit could actually prove to be an even more surprising and potentially very impactful development. And there's a strong historical precedent for this.
What precedent is that?
Remember how Japan normalized relations with communist China? They did it back in 1972. Mao Zedong even famously forgave Japan's war reparations for their wartime actions. And crucially, this happened before the United States formally normalized its own relations with China, which wasn't until 1979.
So Japan moved first with China.
They did. And that historical playbook, that template, could absolutely be used again for Japan engaging with North Korea.
So Japan might again sort of jump ahead of the U.S. in opening diplomatic channels. What are Japan's specific interests in North Korea that would motivate such a bold move? It can't just be about regional stability, surely.
Japan has several really unique, deeply embedded interests and historical ties with North Korea that are quite different from other countries. Take the port city of Wonsan, for example.
Wonsan. Okay. Why is that significant?
It's significant in multiple ways. It was the port where Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, first re-entered the country after World War II, coming back from the Soviet Union. It's also Kim Jong-un's reported hometown, making it symbolically important for the current leadership. And crucially for Japan, Wonsan was the main port where many Zainichi ethnic Korean residents living in Japan repatriated back to North Korea, mostly in the post-war years.
Ah, the Zainichi connection.
Yes. A significant number of those Zainichi Koreans and their descendants still live in and around the Wonsan area today. That gives Japan a very direct personal demographic link. Beyond that, Japan possesses extensive historical knowledge and detailed data about North Korea's vast, largely undeveloped mineral resources. For instance, Japanese engineers discovered and surveyed valuable uranium mines during the colonial period. This historical intelligence, this deep knowledge base, gives Japan a unique informational edge and potentially a significant economic advantage in any future engagement or development scenario.
That adds a whole different dimension to the potential Japan-North Korea relationship history, resources, people, not just the abduction issue, which usually dominates headlines.
Yeah.
Okay, so given all these shifts, all these potential new alignments, U.S.-North Korea talks, Japan-North Korea talks, where does this leave South Korea? It sounds like Seoul faces a critical strategic challenge to avoid being left out, sidelined in its own neighborhood.
Absolutely. That's the crucial question for South Korea. Inter-Korean relations became incredibly strained, frankly almost hostile, during Trump's first term. This was partly due to the shifting U.S. focus, but also partly due to South Korea's difficulty in adapting its own approach. Looking ahead, South Korea desperately needs a profound paradigm shift to its foreign policy thinking.
A completely new approach.
Almost revolutionary, yes. It's undoubtedly difficult, given the painful history, the deep mistrust. But South Korea must find a way to pragmatically acknowledge North Korea as a legitimate state, which it is, recognized by the UN, and move beyond this deeply entrenched historical animosity and ideological rigidity.
Like West Germany did with East Germany. environment.
Exactly. The parallel with West German Chancellor Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, his Eastern policy during the Cold War, is incredibly relevant. Brandt took immense political risks to improve relations with East Germany and other Eastern Bloc countries. He recognized the existing reality despite the huge ideological divide, and ultimately that policy paved the way for German reunification.
So South Korea needs its own Ostpolitik moment. A proactive, pragmatic strategy, not just reacting or sticking to old ideological lines. What's the goal then?
The goal is to seize the new opportunities. South Korea has to adopt a much more pragmatic, active, forward-looking approach to inter-Korean relations if it wants to capitalize on these shifting global dynamics. A proactive stance is absolutely vital to prevent South Korea from being marginalized, from being, as the saying goes, passed over, while the U.S. and Japan potentially move forward with their own engagement with North Korea.
Avoid being left behind.
Precisely. The core message here, echoing those lessons from Nixon and Reagan again, is that South Korea needs to let go of ideological rigidity and embrace a practical, national, interest-driven foreign policy. Making that pivot could open up entirely new avenues. It could lead to a new northern diplomacy, maybe reminiscent of the successful engagement efforts under President Roh Tae-woo back in the day. And think about the economics. With traditional trade, with China facing headwinds, not being as reliable as it once was, engaging constructively with North Korea could potentially offer significant new economic opportunities, maybe even a new engine for growth for the South Korean economy.
Wow. What an incredibly detailed deep dive into this shifting global chessboard. We've really covered a lot of ground. From the surprising silence at that NATO summit and Germany's complex economic strategy.
To Trump's unique but maybe predictable hybrid diplomacy.
Right, and revealing those stark strategic reasons why the U.S. treats Iran and North Korea so differently. We looked at the three distinct paths Iran might rationally choose for its future.
And peered into the crystal ball, seeing that highly probable U.S.-North Korea summit coming potentially soon, while also uncovering that often overlooked Japan-North Korea wildcard.
And through it all, that consistent theme keeps emerging, doesn't it? International politics, it often looks chaotic, may be driven by big ideologies or personalities.
But underneath, it frequently follows these, well, almost predictable patterns, driven by hard-nosed national interests, by pragmatic realities, much more than by rigid, unchanging ideology.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it, how many conflicts that seem completely stuck, intractable, could suddenly find unexpected solutions if leaders just decided to put ideology aside and focus purely on practical gains.
It's a powerful thought. What really stands out to you listening to all this today? And if international relations truly is this high-stakes game of strength versus weakness, if national interest consistently overrides ideology, what does that actually mean for how we as a global community should approach these incredibly difficult diplomatic challenges? What other seemingly impossible diplomatic moves might we see next when national interest really, truly takes center stage?
Those are definitely profound questions to ponder.
And we touched on it briefly, but the unique nature of North Korea's hereditary system, how the Kim family rules, sets it apart from other authoritarian states like Iran. That's something we should probably explore in more detail in a future deep dive. Understanding that fundamental difference in governance is absolutely crucial if you want to really grasp the potential future path of the Korean Peninsula and how it impacts broader international relations.
It is an incredibly complex world out there. But understanding these underlying currents, these historical echoes we've talked about today, it really is key to making some sense of it all. Until next time, keep digging deeper.